So first of all, thank you everyone for being here. I know there are a lot of other events that sort of pulled at everyone's attention, but we really appreciate you being here. As DJ said, my name is Yin, and you probably know me as Charlotte, and I represent the wonderful and wonderfully large class of 2016. So at the end of Pablo Picasso's life, he said to have undergone some sort of a transformative experience. In the last few years before his death, he said to have produced more works than potentially he had produced in the past few decades alone. He said that he feared the one day when he would not be able to put down his paintbrush, the one day he would not be able to paint his passions. And he said that he wished to outpaint his death by producing the best works of his life, regardless of the quality in which he produced every technique or every honing skill, but to ensure that every piece that he produced was out to the public, and that it was this quantity that mattered above else for his passions. Now, in the evolution of mankind, the desire and necessity people have had to hoard as many resources as possible have waned with the diminishing prevalence of the scarcity of resources. And that makes sense. If you have a lot of resources, there's no need to hoard everything that you can get, because you can move on to having higher quality goods. Now, we've moved on from that stage within civilization into valuing luxuries, right? The Excaliburs of society, the luxuries that only one individual can possess and cannot be replaced by anything else. Now, whether or not we're allowed or even can afford such luxuries, the fact remains that society has evolved from admiring he who has the most progeny or he who has the most food, so that makes Genghis Khan pretty much the emperor in every sense, to one that possesses the sword within the stone, the one who possesses that one and only good. Now, even a cursory glance at art shows this sort of trend towards society and how you view society. Now, we see in a lot of ancient civilizations a lot of fertility symbols, right? This is symbolic in the focus on multiplicity, on the fact that you have a lot of something. And later on, we see even a few centuries later, with the rise of empires, because there was stability and because there was a lot of resources, that people are now focusing on showing off the fact that they have so many resources, and in fact are focusing on these luxuries. So they're stepping away from this crude fixation of hoarding goods and moving on and using objects, less for their inherent worth, but for the symbolic value, to show that they have the ability to possess it. Now, Pliny the Elder was a natural philosopher, and he wrote one of the first encyclopedias. And he tells the story of Cleopatra. Now, this story and its antecedents are just as dubious as the woman herself. But that said, Cleopatra is said to have two of the largest pearls within history. She made earrings out of them. Now, one day, she was dining with Mark Antony. We all wonder why. And she was dining and said that, you know what, Mark Antony, I'll give you a bet. I'll say that I will spend 10 million sesterces on a dinner. Now, I've tried to look all over the internet as to how much that would be in exchange value for current day. I don't know. The earliest record that we can find is that about 1.25 sesterces was the average minimum wage of labor at the time. So 10 million is triple, quadruple. You calculate it. It's an enormous amount of money. So Mark Antony says, okay, let's do it. We'll give it a go. So she throws a feast. And it's not really that much different from anything else that she usually throws. So Mark Antony makes fun of her. Is this the best you could do? But Cleopatra, being the woman who never likes to be challenged, says, wait for the second course. A cup of vinegar is brought out in the second course. What she does is she slowly removes one of her earrings, drops it into the cup, dissolves a pearl, and proceeds to drink her 5 million sesterces. Now, before she could do the second one, Mark Antony stops her. Cleopatra 1, Mark Antony 0. So regardless of whether or not the veracity of this story is true, we still see that there's a fundamental value in a stepping away from a person possessing so many of different kinds of things, but in fact possessing that one irreparable and irreplaceable object of luxury. So why is it that I argue we're slowly returning to a society of multiplicity? It seems counterintuitive. It is by no means because we're degenerating into a pre-modern society, or because somehow we've adopted a Marxist form of cyclical wealth. It's also not because people simply got tired of scrabbling for resources. It's because modern technology and innovation has made it moot for any really rare object to not be accessible to the common man. Now, we can take a look at the 20th century rise of the Tiger nations, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and my very own South Korea. Now, all of these countries rose on modernization and industrial competition. And while history books like to say that they rose to such power and eminence because of this export-based economy, because they industrialized extremely efficiently, the main source and the true source is competition. What competition does, ladies and gentlemen, it isn't just an issue where we're trying to find the best efficiency within industrialization and modernization. It means people are trying to reach the epitome of what they can best achieve and try to out-quantify one another by producing the best quality goods. So while initially being good in one single field is the ultimate goal, we see that this alone doesn't suffice in a competitive environment because we see individuals who are better and becoming the best at multiple fields. And because of this competition, we see that a single field isn't enough. Now, tiger parenting has also risen from the ashes of this modern desire for recognition, proving the widespread, albeit grudging, acknowledgement that it just simply doesn't work to be good at one major thing. Because how exactly are you supposed to compete against individuals who have basically been manufactured from the perfectionist ideals of parents? Now that's an issue that maybe we as Princetonians would take into consideration, and it takes the term tiger to a completely different level. Now, in a similar geographic setting, the rise of the brick economy has also proven this point. And no matter how much America and the European Union would like to depict China, as in particular, as a nation that has a lot of quantity, but of maybe dubious quality, there's a reason why they like to portray that nation as such. It's because they're afraid that somewhere in the future, that this massive quantity will somehow transfer itself into a quality that will outstrip any current nation that is in the modern economy. And this is a viable threat. We do acknowledge the fact that the infrastructure required and the funding required to mobilize such a massive country would be near impossible for the next few years. But it is a viable option that in the decades to come, that countries like China and India will become powerhouses of Asian economies that could potentially take over the international economy. So why is this so? We take a look once again at competition. This isn't just because they have lots of massive quantities of different objects, of people, of goods, but it's because all of these quantities can be competed against one another and pitted against one another so that we see higher and higher quality goods, in which case all of these brick nations could become world powers very, very soon. And we see this as a viable alternative. Now, which isn't to say, on the other hand, that massive trade-offs of quality is obviously compromised for the sake of quantity. If somebody really needs to tell the producer of Breaking Dawn that if you try to split the ending into two different movies, it doesn't dilute the horror of the actual plot. You also see the producer of Rebecca Black's Friday, that was unquestionable musicality. He comes back with an equally terrifying It's Thanksgiving that doesn't help us forget the former. So obviously, there's a trade-off between quality and quantity. But on a more serious note, there are sometimes large quantities without rationality that could lead to dangerous consequences. Just because The Onion's sexiest man of the year, Kim Jong-un, is said to have 100% popularity rate, doesn't mean that by any means this high quantity proves to be any political legitimacy for his regime. In fact, it's one of the few countries in the world where your popularity rate amongst the people is inversely related to the living standards of your people as well. Because we see a man-made famine used and obstructed just for the case of political legitimacy so that he can keep his people under his rule. And equally terrifying, in my personal opinion, quantity mob mentality is Psy's music video, Gangnam Style, which, by the way, just broke the Guinness record for most liked video on YouTube. When we see that Time Magazine is saying that we should nominate Psy to become the next person of the year, I question the reasoning behind quantitative analysis, and I also question, it's almost to the point where we see like when the EU was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, it's almost that bad when I question why in the world Psy is even nominated to become the next Time Person of the Year. But that, again, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the reasons why quantity alone shouldn't just be the factor for analyzing the quality of a good. Now, this is a definitive quality, however, when we look at political uprisings, because quantity has eventually becoming a shifting paradigm to equate into quality, so the more is actually better. Now, why is this? Time recognized the protester as Person of the Year last year, and what they weren't actually just symbolizing was they weren't just supporting the people who were there, the principles behind the revolutions, but they were supporting and emphasizing the sheer numbers behind this revolution, behind the reasoning why in social networking alone, we could gather and amass millions of people for the same cause. This was a glorification and the reason why the protester was named Person of the Year. It wasn't because of the simple democratic principles they stood for. It was because it was possible to mobilize such massive numbers. And it wasn't just this that we see in terms of just quantity. It's because this quantity led to a better quality of government. They're trying to overthrow a dictatorship towards democracy. And this is exactly the sort of paradigm shift that we see. So it's about the 99% who, despite their mixed message, found it a necessity to argue against the established order. It was about the bread maker, the accountant, the mother who was tired of watching a tyrannical regime shoot down their neighbors as they walked about their daily lives. It was about Demetrius Christolus, who stated that I see no other situation and no other solution than this dignified end to my life, and shot himself in the central of Athens Square, unable to pay his debts, unable to face the rest of his family. It was about the masses documented in Guy Fawkes' Mass, about the one who metaphorically stood in front of the tank, and it was about the quantities, big and small, the numbers, significant and sometimes trivial. Now, albeit this was all about the quality of life, but that's where the paradigm shift comes in. It isn't just that quality is any better than quantity, or vice versa. Am I starting to confuse you yet? It's that the two have become irreplaceable and so linked to the point where, once again, quantity has become an equation of quality. So in preschool, when we heard that, oh, quality is always better than quantity, I'm sure all of you guys have heard of that. We could have been billionaires by the time if we got a dime for every time we heard that in preschool. It's actually not the case anymore. There has been a definitive paradigm shift. And this has massive implications for students as well. For college admissions, especially in Ivy League institutions, it's becoming a race to the craziest, most sleep-deprived candidate. This may come off a bit radical, but there are extremities in terms of things that candidates would do to get into college. Not only are kids multi-world champions in fencing, but certified chefs, CEOs of software companies, even before they step foot into Princeton, interns at the White House, skipped a grade, a daughter, a friend, a sister, so many different roles and able to balance all of them. As David Brooks, a New York columnist who visited campus just a while ago, stated, we are students by profession, and that has several implications. It doesn't just mean that we spend the majority of our time as students. It also means that we have honed our technique of being a student so well that it has become an actual profession, that we are overcommitted, that we are goal-oriented, and in fact, many of us had trouble even being here tonight. But that said, we're also becoming increasingly competitive and more intelligent because of this values for quality the quantity over quality, because they're becoming equations of one and the same. So as Brooks said, we aren't led by the stick that lures us, we're lured by the carrot, because we wouldn't have it any other way. That despite our overcommitments, despite the fact that we acknowledge that we have to be good at not only one thing, but multiple different things, we wouldn't have it any other way. So in the end, this changing paradigm of how we view achievement and success has massive implications for everything from our daily routine to international economics. And it has massive implications for decades to come. And when more has actually become better, we've entered into a world that no longer fixates upon the primitive differentiation between quantity and quality, but an inevitable convergence between the two. So whether it's Facebook's mutual friends or LinkedIn's constant updates telling you to expand your networks, it's inevitable that at a certain point, we need to recognize that numbers are the ones that matter, that it's quantity that we should be focusing on. Thank you very much.